All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate all of you joining this morning for this webinar, Unraveling the Mystery of Tableau Level of Detail Expressions. It's kind of a mouthful, but yeah, thanks for taking some time out of your Friday to be here. Really appreciate that. So we'll start with a little bit of introduction, and then yeah, we'll get underway here in full just shortly. So. A lot of you I know, a lot of familiar names. So thanks to all of the former students of the classes I've taught that are here. Thanks for all the regular blog readers and interactors. Really appreciate that. For those that I haven't had a chance to meet before, my name's Eric. I work with this organization, One Number. We're based right in Tableau's backyard, maybe 3 miles to their headquarters from where I live. And I've been teaching their classes and consulting on projects for them for 6 years now. And yeah, it's pretty crazy. Thanksgiving 2013, I ended up sitting on a flight next to somebody who worked for Tableau. And that's when I first heard about it and kind of got involved in this whole world. So pretty fun to reflect back on and then be looking toward all that's coming up. So we got an action-packed 30 minutes ahead of us. Wish we had 2 hours, but that's just not practical, I don't think, for most people's schedules. So we'll be underway. If you have any kind of questions or anything that comes up during the webinar, just to make this flow well, because there's quite a few folks attending, I'm not really going to be able to unmute you, except for maybe at the very end. So if questions do pop up, feel free to use the questions section or the chat section in the GoToWebinar dialog. I'll try to be monitoring it as I go, but mostly I will be addressing those questions at the end. So you're welcome to type them as they come up. If I catch it and I can address it in the moment, I will, but there's so many things going on with my screen, trying to present, making sure people are connected, trying to monitor questions. Sometimes I miss those, but I promise we'll spend some time talking about them at the very end. Well, let's dive right into it. So today's webinar is all about level of detail expressions, right? And seems like there's quite a few people that are interested to learn more about how these work, which is totally fair, because these expressions they're really powerful. They give you the flexibility to write all types of calculations and solve all kinds of problems that you couldn't otherwise, but I would say they're not always really well defined or really well understood. So how I define a level of detail expression is it's an aggregation. It's a function which allows you to aggregate data at a specified dimension level. So you get to pick exactly what level that aggregation is happening at. It is a fairly unique concept of Tableau, at least the way that they language it. So the most similar things I could think of would be like a group by function in SQL, or an aggregate tool in Alteryx, or a pivot table in Excel. So those are kind of cousins to what we're going to look at, but we are going to talk about how Tableau handles those things. So I got a list down there of some of the different examples we'll look at. Time allowing, we'll do all of those, but there may be 1 or 2 at the end we don't. For those that maybe we don't have a chance to get to all the way, I'll make sure that I provide some follow-up information so that that's something that you can continue to dig more into if you'd like to. And going back to the little introductory emoji and how this webinar was marketed, you'll notice there's actually 4 different functions that are referenced: fixed, include, exclude, and then just the curly braces. For today's webinar, we're pretty much just going to be talking about fixed and the curly braces. I'm going to provide some follow-up links, which will talk more about include and exclude. The way I think about those is it's like your knife block in your kitchen, right? Like your knife block, you have like 10 or 20 knives in there. And yes, there are these special circumstances where you end up grabbing some knives, but really there's like 3 or 4 that you continue to use on a regular basis. At least that's true in my life. So I think of level of detail expressions like that. And I mainly use fixed in the curly brace, but there's no reason you couldn't use those other ones as well. And the biggest differentiator between those functions that are on the left side and those that are on the right is where these things fall in Tableau's order of operations. So if this image, Tableau's order of operations, if this isn't something that you're familiar with, I would highly, highly recommend get familiar with it, tattoo it or whatever, print it out, paste it on your wall, keep it on your desktop, because this is, I would say, really the key to understanding how Tableau works. And you'll notice that fixed level of detail expressions happen here, which is about a half a step before dimension filters, and exclude functions happen here, which is about a half step afterwards. We're going to investigate in more detail together today why that matters. All right. So we'll go ahead and dive into our first example together. So I've got just some Superstore data connected here. It's a bar chart showing us sales by category. So as what you probably know is that Tableau always aggregates data at the level of whatever dimensions you pulled in the view. So there's 3 categories, so we get 3 sales bars. Or if I bring subcategories into this, now we're up to 17 bars because there's 17 subcategories. So this actually, this example came from something a student asked me a few years back. She put together a visual like this, and she was saying, you know, my end users would really like to be able to just see the total sales by category, okay? And there are ways I can do that. For instance, I could, you know, put totals as a bar in the bar chart, but I mean, those, you know, kind of throw off the whole scope of the visual. I could tell my users that they need to select the bars and then hover and wait, and then eventually the tooltip will tell you, but neither of those things are super intuitive. So what might be nice would be just to have a label right after category that would say like furniture, 742,000. So if I just grab sales from measures right now and throw this on rows, first off, it creates a scatter plot because there's a measure on columns and a measure on rows. That's Tableau's default behavior. Well, we want to see the sales here as a label, not as an axis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch sum of sales on rows from continuous to discrete. So for those that have been in the webinars before, this is probably starting to sound like old news, but continuous creates axes, discrete creates labels. So I switch this to discrete, and now you can just see the dollar amounts listed here. Now, the bummer about this is this sum of sales, even though it's a discrete field, it's still getting broken down all the way at the subcategory level. So even if I drag this between category and subcategory, you'll notice it's still giving us 17 unique sales values. So what we really want to see is sales aggregated at the category level. So this is a perfect place to plug in a fixed expression. And here's what this will look like. I'm going to create a new calculated field. I'll just call this my category sales. It's going to look like this. I'm going to say fixed at the category level. Return to me my sum of sales. So let me just zoom in and pause and leave this on the screen for a moment. While you're taking that in, I'm going to address a quick question, which was about where to get that order of operations diagram. I will include that in the follow-up info that I send. And also, I think I did not mention this at the beginning. I'll be recording this webinar and uploading the recording. I know some of these pieces will move kind of fast, so if there's something that you want to go back over, you're able to do that. Okay. So the way that a level of detail expression works is you always have an aggregation you're referencing. So what we're telling Tableau is give us the sum of sales at the category level. Okay. I don't really have any examples today where I would need to do this, but you can also comma delimit multiple dimensions if you want to fix at multiple levels at the same time. Okay, so let's check this out. I'm going to hit OK. We'll go ahead and do a little number formatting for that category sales we've created. And now we're going to take that same approach we just did previously. It didn't really work out for us. So let's take that, the original sum of sales off of rows. Got our category sales in red. Switch that to be discrete. And move that between category and subcategory on the row shelf. So you can see, that's the sales for the entire category, not drilled down to the subcategory level. So if this still feels a little bit funny, like how exactly does all this work? Check this out. If I put the category sales field next to the just regular sales field as another bar, you'll see it just repeats the same sales figure over and over again because it's just summarizing now at the category instead of the subcategory level. Okay, so there's number one for us. So example number two, we're going to look at some customer cohorts. So in this bar chart, I'm just showing sales that occurred for the Superstore business in 2016 to 2019. And so let's say the question that I've been tasked with answering is, what percent of sales that occurred in 2019 came from customers that first bought something from us in 2016? Okay, so like we need to have like a customer first order date or something like that. And unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this data set. So there's not like a customer start date or a customer first order date. So you might think like, oh, couldn't I just put like the minimum year of order date on color? Remember that Tableau is always aggregating at the level of whatever dimensions in the view. So if I try to put minimum order date on color, what it's going to do is it's going to give me the minimum value in each year. So the minimum in 2016 is January 3rd, 2016, whereas the minimum in 2019 is January 1st, 2019. So what we really want is the minimum order date per customer. Once again, turn to a calculated field for this. So I'll just call this my customer first order date. Some more syntax. I'm going to say fixed at the customer name level, return to me my minimum order date. Okay, so min and max might feel a little bit funny to you if you primarily use those for numbers. Right? For numbers, they make more sense. If you have 100 rows of data, row one is value 1, row 2 is value 2. You ask for the maximum value, the max is going to be 100. Now, if you ask for the maximum date, you're going to get the latest date. Minimum date will give you the earliest date. And if you use min and max for text fields like customer names, if you ask for the minimum customer name, that's going to give you the first alphabetically. So that piece of knowledge will come in handy for us in just a little bit. So, okay, I've got my customer first order date. Tableau says everything's valid. I'm going to drop this on color. And you can see we kind of get a little bit of an interesting story here. Let me just resort these bars for a moment. Okay, so you can see that our 2016 customer segment has actually been pretty loyal and pretty consistent over time. They bought $484,000 worth of goods for us in 2016. It kind of dipped down and then it picked back up all the way to $533,000 by 2019. And you can see each year we're having a new cohort added because each year you pick up new customers for that year, hopefully. So our last little bit was figuring out the percent of total. Let's do a table calculation for that. Not really the focus of what we're doing today. But now I can see, nope, that's not the right scope. There we go. So now I can see that almost 73% of all sales in 2019 came from that 2016 cohort. Awesome. So that's example number 2. Just got a good question. Will I share this workbook? Yeah. So in the follow-up, when I go to publish this video, I'll upload this to my Tableau public and link this out as well. So if you want to dig back through this and reverse engineer anything we've done, then you're able to. Okay. So example number 3 that we will look at is we're going to be calculating customer behavior frequency. So for instance, in this example that I have just started to build out the framework to, the question that we're answering for our healthcare system is, how many times did patients visit our system in 2018? So I want to know, like, how many patients made just one visit? How many patients made 5 visits? How many made 50 visits? That kind of thing. Okay. So we're going to approach this a little bit differently. You can see I've got my count distinct of patient ID on rows already. So we have 366 patients. And now I want to know how many visits they made. Here's what this will look like. I'm going to create a calculated field. I'll call this visits per patient. And it's going to look like this. I'm going to say fixed at the patient level. And I'm going to use patient ID. Give me a count distinct of my visit ID. Okay, so the way this should work, ideally, one row of data corresponds to one visit. but I suppose it's possible somebody came for a single visit and that became 2 rows of data because initially they got checked into the ER and then they got sent to imaging, so maybe that was 2 rows. So we only want to count each unique visit as 1 visit. So that's why we're doing count distinct as opposed to maybe something like count, which is more like a row count. All right, so I'll hit OK on this. So visits per patient becomes a measure. We actually want it to be more like a dimension. Like I want to see labels at the bottom that will be like 1, 2, 3. So here's what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to drag visits per patient up 2 dimensions. Okay, so then we can see of our, I think it was 366 patients, 111 of them just made 1 visit. You can see that drops off. And then eventually we end up with a couple patients who have had 194 visits. So for those that have been following the blog, I think a week or 2, I did a blog post very similar to this. I suppose that is possible that somebody could have visited a healthcare system 194 times in a year, but to have 2 people do that is pretty high. And you can just see there's a lot of really high numbers in general. So here's actually what's happening here. This is not the number of visits that somebody made just in 2018. This is their number of lifetime visits. Somebody made 194 visits to our hospital ever. So if you're wondering, like, how do I know that? Or like, other than the fact that's a high number, what's the giveaway here? The giveaway to me is where the fixed expression falls in Tableau's order of operations. So what we did is we have this fixed expression figuring out how many visits did somebody make. Then we filtered on 2018. So what we really want to do is we want to push 2018 up a step to become a context filter. So all of our data filters down to 2018, then we're calculating how many visits people made, right? So that may kind of ring a bell, or this may be completely new. So I'll make sure that if I can find some additional information, I'll make sure that I'll send that on context filters as well. What we're going to do is hit the drop down next to year of admit date and say add to, I did that a little fast. I didn't mean to click it so fast. Hit the drop down and say add to context. Okay. And now you can see these numbers seem a lot more within the realm of possibility. Instead of 192 visits in a year, we're talking about, 52 visits in a year. So yeah, that's probably a lot more realistic. And now we could go back and fact check that. Okay. And notice your visual cue that a filter is added to context is as now gray, not blue. And you can still just use a context filter as if it's a regular dimension filter. That's totally fine. Your end user doesn't really know the difference. All right, cool. All right, so 3 examples down, maybe 4 to go, maybe a little bit less. All right. Another way that I frequently like to use level of detail expressions is to help me to deduplicate data. So this dashboard's not finished yet. I've just kind of got the framework built out. If Brian is on the call, shout out to you, Brian. This is similar to something we've worked on for a while. So let's say that you are kind of a third-party company that helps your clients get better rates for their shipping. So maybe they just use exclusively UPS, but you say, hey, we have relationships with FedEx and DHL and a bunch of other shippers, and maybe we can get you a better deal than what you're paying right now. So the customer's current cost is $5,600, and we think that maybe we could do better. All right. Let me go ahead and just unhide the sheets that are in this dashboard. Okay. So first of all, how much is the customer currently paying for each shipment? Let's go ahead and just take a moment to look at how this data is set up. Okay. So these, I think I just highlighted 5 rows of data. These are all part of shipment 100. So you can see that shipment 100, the current cost of the customer is $320. Now that repeats over and over again, but that's just based on the way this data is structured. They only paid $320 once. What we're doing is we have 5 rows of data because we want to say, okay, well, for these different carriers, UPS and FedEx and all of these, what is the cost that they could provide? So like UPS could give you $300, so you'd actually save $20, right? So what we want to do is to figure out, well, what is the cheapest option per shipment that our customer could pay? So we could manually scan down and find that, like for shipment 100, it's going to be this $250 through Central, right? So with the way the data is aggregating right now, like this is showing us how much is our customer currently paying for each shipment and how much can we save them. So currently this is the sum of current costs. This is all the values added together. I don't want them to add 325 times. So I'm going to set this to, let's say, the maximum of their current cost. So there you go. That's showing that they're just paying $320 here. And then because I have the data broken down all the way to the shipment level, I could just put carrier cost on here and ask, well, what's the minimum carrier cost? Okay, so cool. We can get you this one for 250 bucks. We can get you this one for 74. We can get you this one for 205. And then it might not always be the case that we could provide them savings, right? Like, oh, this one, the best we could do is 260. So actually they should just stay with their current carrier on that one. So we've got kind of an interesting calculation to write. So let me go ahead and do this. First of all, I'm going to figure out what is the minimum carrier cost per shipment. Okay, and we'll do this. So I'll say fixed at the shipment ID level, give me my minimum carrier cost. Okay. And now I'm going to come up with another calculation that will either give them, it will give them the carrier cost, or if their current cost is cheaper, just leave them with that one. I'll just call this cheapest option. So I'll say this: if the minimum carrier cost is less than your, let me think about how I would do this for a second. This might be going down a little bit more of a complicated road than I want to get into just now, but essentially you'd say something like, if your minimum carrier cost is less than your current cost, then give me the minimum carrier cost. Otherwise, give me my existing carrier cost. I'll just go ahead and write it. I probably won't have time to explain this in nearly as much detail as I'd like. Yeah, I think this will still work. This ends up flaming out, then we'll just move on. So this is where level of detail expressions, I would say, can start to get pretty heady because of all the interlaced aggregations that you start to use. You just got to make sure that you aggregate your calculations equally. Like either every measure has an aggregation or not, but you can't kind of mix and match. So if that worked, I don't know for sure that it did, but if it did, then this should show us, okay, 250, 74, 205, 73, 250, nice, that worked, 160. And so now I come through here, well, what's your current cost? I guess we need to calculate the current cost as well. So welcome to the world of level of detail expressions, especially when you have data sources that are structured like this. You have to do a lot of aggregations because you're constantly taking several rows of data and then trying to turn them into, well, I don't know. What am I trying to say here? I'm a bad multitasker. You're constantly taking a lot of data and then trying to consolidate it to find like the lowest value or the highest value. All right, I'm probably not going to end up quite finishing this out all the way, but essentially that's not right. Well, the current cost is $1,100, and what we could probably do for them would be, I need to add all those together. Something close to this. I need to work through this a little bit more. All right. I know I was a little bit all over the place. That was probably a pretty big apple to bite off of. We probably could have just taken a whole 30 minutes to work on this example, but hopefully that was kind of an interesting look into a more complicated data set where you might want that. So I think we'll just look at one more example together, and then I'll just show you what are a couple other things you could do without us building them out all the way. And I'll send some follow-up information that you can use to build those out for yourself as well. So one last one that I want to look at is how to use fixed expression to filter your data down to the latest date in your data set. Okay, so I've got a fairly simplified data set here. that just has, you can just ignore number of records. So it just has like a date and what the outstanding claim amount is that like an insurance company is handling, for instance. So for instance, like, okay, at the start of February, they were handling about $1 million in claims. It's kind of gradually gone up. And by March 1st, it was at 1.134 million. Now that's actually down a little bit from February 28th because, you know, maybe some of the claims got processed, whatever it was. So what I want to do is I want the data to always just focus on whatever that latest date is. And right now, this is just showing me the maximum outstanding claim amount, which was actually 2 days ago. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a calculated field, and I'll just start by calling this latest date. So to find the latest date in the data set, I'm going to write a level of detail expression like this. It's just opening curly brace, max, date, closed curly brace. This is sort of a spin-off of the fixed function. The difference here is that this is finding the fixed value, in this case, the maximum date value for the entire data set, not just locked in on a single dimension. Okay, so just to show you what that is, I'm just going to go ahead and throw that on text. We're not going to leave it there. But what is that latest date? Cool. It figured out that it's March 1st, 2018. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a calculation. I'll just call this my latest date filter. And I'll just say this. Does the latest date field equal the current date? So this data set's about 1 month of data. So for, I don't know, I guess it was February, so my numbers are going to get all mixed up. But for like 28 days, it's going to be false. It does not equal each other. But then on March 1st, it will be true. So what I can do is throw this latest date filter on the filters card and just select true. Hit OK. And notice that number just dropped off from 1.138 down to 1.134, which is the number for our latest date. So that's just an example of how you can use a fixed expression, or in this case, just a curly braced level of detail expression to filter down to the latest date. Okay. So let me just explain what the last couple examples were. I threw them in here in case we had time, realizing that that was probably unrealistic. But two other things. One is that you can use a level of detail expression to create a value that doesn't change with filters. So I'll go ahead and I'll send some follow-up information on that. And that really just comes down to utilizing Tableau's order of operations to sort of hack your way around. So dimension filter doesn't affect the fixed expression. Like I said, more coming on that. And the last one, I'll just briefly flip over to another workbook for this, is that you could use a level of detail expression in a calculation to have a title in a secondary dashboard update based on what's selected in a first dashboard. So in this example I've set up, if I select just a single hospital and drill through to the second dashboard, it tells me the second dashboard is like, oh, this is the profile for the Alaska Native Medical Center. If I select multiple, then the title would say profile for multiple hospitals. And if I select all the hospitals, that's a huge block of text right there, but then it would say profile for all hospitals. So we kind of get a variety of different options here based on what's been selected, and that's partially helped put together through a level of detail expression. So more coming on that through a link in a blog post. So I realize it's already been half an hour, which these always go by so fast. I do have quite a few questions, which I'll stick around for, but I also recognize that I want to honor your time and just say thanks for being here. If you have to drop off, that's totally cool. But if you do want to stick around for a little while, I'll look forward to answering questions, and I'll start with those that have already been typed in. And if you want to send some in while I'm answering those that are currently out there, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay, a couple of these I've answered. Let's see, one question, oh gosh, this is probably now based on something I was doing a while ago. It's hard for me to remember where I was at 9:20 when the question came in. When I add something to text, does it just go up one notch? I think this was probably related to when we were adding sales as a label. I could be wrong on this, so feel free to let me know. But when we change a field from continuous to discrete, we can choose what level it happens at. But if you have a continuous field or a measure, that will always have to come after your discrete fields. I'm not sure if that was the question. Hopefully that answers that, but feel free to type in again and re-clarify if I missed what you were saying there. So one question, I think this was probably around the hospital, how many people visited the healthcare system in 2018. So the question was, could we also filter to 2018 by just typing that into the level of detail expression? Yeah, sure. I don't see any reason why that couldn't work. So what you would have to do in that case, find visit per patient, I would call it like this. I would call it 2018 visits per patient. And then here's how I'd write this. I would say if the year of my date field, it's not the right date field. Hold on one second. If the year of admit date equals 2018, then visit ID end. So this is how you would hard code to make sure you are only counting visits from 2018 and not including other years as well. And this would still work the same. You just wouldn't have to worry about adding that filter to context, for instance. Okay. Let's see. So another question I got was how to calculate the total purchases of one customer who maybe had multiple order IDs. So the way that you would do that, I mean, it depends on what you're trying to do. So like for instance, there's no reason in that case, if you wanted to show your data at a customer level, that you couldn't put customer in your see like, oh, Sean Miller had $25,000 in total sales. Now, maybe there's a reason that you want to just create a calculation that just, pre-aggregates all of that. So in that case, this would be super similar to what we've just done. So I would say something like fixed on my customer name, return to me my sum of sales. So in this case, then you could be like, how many customers bought $100 worth of goods? How many bought 150? In this Superstore data set, this would become a mess because there's a lot of kind of odd dollar amounts. But if, let's say you only sell 3 products, one is $500, one's $1,000, and one's $10,000, maybe you could get some nice round whole numbers that would make more sense for that. Okay, let's see, we've got a few other questions. Let's see, I got some questions about just the curly braces and filtering on the max dates and like, oh, why would we do that versus just filtering on the max date? So going back to that, this is something I think I just cut out for the sake of time. So the reason that I set up the latest date filter the way that it was, oh, that's this latest date. So the reason I set up latest date filter the way that I did is because Tableau will not simply let you do this. Does the date equal the maximum date? The reason that Tableau doesn't like this approach is because this date on the left is not aggregated and this date on the right is aggregated. And Tableau never likes that when part of your calculation is aggregated and part of it's not. So in some ways, using the curly braces is kind of a funny workaround. Tableau does not think of this as an aggregated field, even though it clearly is, right? Like max date, that's an aggregation. But the second you wrap it in the curly braces, Tableau goes, oh, cool, not an aggregation. Because the way Tableau thinks about this is for the 30 rows of data in this data set, it's just repeating 3/1/2018 over and over and over and over again. So that's a great question. That's why we took that approach. All right. Time for about maybe 1 or 2 more, and then we'll peel out from there. Question about how to get the recording. Yeah, so what I'll do, I got to kind of process it and upload it and all that. So early next week, you should get an email from me, or you can maybe even check the blog this afternoon, and it should be up then. Somebody was mentioning that context filters can affect the performance of the dashboards when the data is huge. So yeah, good comment, something to be aware of. Definitely do some performance testing. Could potentially help depending on the size of the data you're filtering down to. But yeah, maybe typing that 2018 into the calculation would be preferable. Let's see. Cool. So mostly good feedback. And then One other thing was, can a fixed level of detail expression be used as an alternative to a multi-row calculation? Unfortunately, not really. And one of the restrictions to know about level of detail expressions is you can't combine them with table calculation functions. So this calculation is going to make no sense. But if I tried to write something like this, oh, give me the fixed based on date, based on the rank of the sum of outstanding claim amount, Tableau would say level of detail expressions cannot contain table calculations or the attribution function. So that's just something to be aware of. That could potentially trip you up. So right on. Well, thank you so much for taking part in this. I know there's maybe still a couple questions out there we didn't get a chance to tackle completely. So if you do want to follow up with me, I've got my email on the screen right now, and I think a lot of you are in regular communication regardless. So feel free to fire those along. And like I said, by early next week, I will have all this content up and available to rewatch. And yeah, you can always send more questions from there. So yeah, thanks so much for joining. Thank you for all the great feedback too. I'm glad to hear this was helpful. It's a complex topic. And so this is something we could maybe even do an advanced LOD webinar at some point. So yeah, thanks again. I'll just stick around and for just another minute, just in case anything really urgent comes in. Otherwise, have a great weekend, have a good May, and I'll look forward to catching up with you at a later date.